One of my favorite TV shows, Netflix Stranger Things Season 2 will be on October 27th. Stranger Things is an 80s themed sci-fi fantasy. It's like a kid's film with a sense of danger. It's like reading your first Stephen King novel. I love it. It's just brilliant. But have you ever wondered why the Duffer Brothers set the show starting in November 6, 1983? Is Hawkins a real place? Why is there only one monster in the Upside Down? Why was the gate or temporary portal in the base of tree? And what is this Upside Down place? Well, in this video I would like to focus on the show's real-life inspiration to answer some of these questions. Stranger Things is set in the fictional town of Hawkins in the fictional Rowan County, Indiana. When Netflix first announced the show, it was under the name Montauk. The series was initially supposed to take place on Montauk, which is a real place in New York, Long Island. And the location was a reference to the locale of one of Stranger Things' real-life inspiration, the Montauk Project. So what was the Montauk Project? During World War II, there was a naval experiment with a battleship, the USS Eldridge, in 1943. They conducted experiments in magnetic invisibility, radar invisibility and optical invisibility. This project's official name is Project Rainbow, but was nicknamed the Philadelphia Experiment. Would it be coincidence that the Philadelphia Experiment, a 1984 sci-fi film, had similar opening credit with Stranger Things? For some reason the Philadelphia Experiment was covered up soon after the experiment was over, which some say is because they made a huge scientific discovery and the ship was accurately transported over space and time, then reappeared. How? There were two tests in 1943, the first one on July 22nd, and the final one on August 12th. By the way, it's important to note that it happened on August 12th. Back then, scientists were working with the concept of manipulating time to make an object invisible. Displace the ship in time by preventing any reflection of light or radar energy from it. If there is no reflected light and radar energy, you are not going to see it. The first time this test was performed, the ship didn't disappear all the way, and supposedly left the imprint of the hull in the water. The second time the ship totally disappeared in a green fog and was sighted in Norfolk, Virginia by the crew of the surface submarine Xander First. Although this was a remarkable breakthrough in terms of technology, it was a catastrophe to the people involved. Sailors who had been transported returned in a state of complete mental disorientation and horror. Some mentally ill for the rest of their life. Some came back embedded in the bulkhead, decks and railings of the ship and soon just didn't come back at all. There are also accounts of people that were on the ship, later bursting into flames. Maybe this is why the Duffer Brothers said the Upside Down is bad for human health. Living in the Upside Down for a week is going to have long-lasting negative effects on Will. At the end of the first season we can see Will flash into the Upside Down, but humans from our side were never meant to live in the Upside Down for an extended period of time. That's the place we wanted to go and potentially explore in Season 2. You probably say, what does this side effect on sailors have to do with Will's time in the Upside Down? I will explain it after I mention a few important figures that were involved in Project Rainbow. After the war, research continued under Dr. John von Neumann, who had directed the technical aspects of the Philadelphia experiments. His new orders were to find out what made the mind of man tick and why people could not be subject to the Philadelphia experiment without disaster. A massive human factor study was begun at Brookhaven National Laboratories in Long Island. It was known as the Phoenix Project. While at the Brookhaven National Lab, Dr. Neumann developed a virtual mind-reading machine and further developed technology in which a psychic, or more like his human subject, could affect the mind of another human being, or mind control others. Yep, they were messing with human minds. A report was supposedly made to the US Congress, but the Congress rejected for fear of having their own minds controlled. So proposal was made directly to the US Department of Defense promising a powerful new weapon that could control enemies' minds. Without congressional approval, the project would have to be top secret and secretly funded. Then a new research facility was established at Camp Hero, a derelict Air Force station at Montauk Point, New York. This place was chosen because it housed a huge SAGE radar antenna that emitted a frequency of 400 to 425 MHz. Coincidentally, the same band used to enter the consciousness of the human mind. In the late 60s the reactivation of Camp Hero began, and by 1972, the Montauk Project was fully underway with massive mind control experimentation being undertaken upon humans and animals. At Camp Hero during 70s and early 80s, Experiments were conducted in teleportation. Mind control experiments were conducted. Homeless people were abducted and subjected to electromagnetic radiation. Few survived. Runaway boys were abducted and brought to the base where they underwent excruciating physical and mental torture to break their minds, then be reprogrammed. Many were supposedly killed and buried on the site. Metahumans and experiments and special serums to create such individuals were tested. People had their psychic abilities enhanced to the point where they could manifest objects with their thoughts. A porthole in time was created which allowed researchers to travel anywhere in time and space. This was later developed into a time tunnel. Contact was made with aliens through the time tunnel and technology was exchanged with them which enhanced the project. This allowed broader access to hyperspace. What is hyperspace? We'll cover that in a minute. On August 12, 1983, the time travel project at Camp Hero interlocked in hyperspace with the original Rainbow Project back in 1943. The USS Eldridge was drawn into hyperspace and trapped there. Two men, Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron, leapt from the deck of the Eldridge while it was in hyperspace and ended up at Camp Hero in the year 1983, where they claimed to have met Dr. John von Neumann, even though he was known to have died in 1957. Von Neumann had supposedly worked on the original Philadelphia experiment, but the U.S. Navy denies this. Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron from the Camp Hero site traveled back to the USS Eldridge and shut down the generators. The ship returned to Philadelphia Naval Yard in 1943 and subsequently the time tunnel collapsed. Then who were Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron? During the Philadelphia experiment in 1943, there were a total of 181 sailors involved in the project, 21 survived, most only to die a short time later, 20 were dead and 120 never came back. One of the survivors of the Philadelphia experiments was Al Bielek. In one interview he talked about his experience during the test. He and his brother Duncan Cameron were inside the control room of the USS Eldridge during the experiment that took place in August 12, 1943. In the interview he said,
"The big problem was that the personnel stationed on the deck of the Eldridge were very badly hit by the high-powered, electromagnetic radiation. They were thoroughly disoriented. Their nervous systems dysfunctioned. We were inside the control room during the experiment. The radiation had no effect on those of us who were below deck because we were shielded by the steel." Into hyperspace. Mathematically speaking, it is a domain that is outside of our normal, three-dimensional reality. It is outside of six-dimensional reality. There are three physical dimensions as we see them and there are three time dimensions. So the ship was outside our domain, including time. Hyperspace is a nice mathematical term that says it is nowhere in terms of our reality.
From this, we may assume that this hyperspace could be the upside down in Stranger Things and link sailors' after effects to that of Will.
The equipment started to go haywire. Then we started getting some high voltage chargeovers like many lightning bolts even though there was no high voltage equipment in the room to cause such an effect. We went on deck. A greenish haze. Sailors were running around in circles like they were totally disoriented. We jumped overboard only we never hit the water. We were at the Montauk base on Long Island. They took us to a building and went down several floors in an elevator, underground. An elderly civilian walked toward us and said, "Gentlemen, I've been waiting for you. I'm Dr. von Neumann." We told him he could not be John von Neumann because he is a much younger man. We left him about an hour ago. He said, "Oh yes. I am. Unfortunately, you are no longer in 1943. This is 1983. I am 40 years older. Welcome to Montauk. This is Phoenix Project."
Now wait a second. Are these people saying that Al Bielek and his brother Duncan Cameron time traveled from 1943 to 1983? Yep, that's exactly what they're saying. Let's get back to the interview because it gets quite fascinating from this point on.
They took us back to John von Neumann who said, "Gentlemen, we have a problem. Your ship, the Eldridge, is still in the hyperspace and the bubble around it is growing. We can turn off the equipment here at Montauk but your ship's equipment is still running and feeding the hyperspace bubble. Unless it breaks down, there is enough fuel on board to run the generator for 30 days. And if the hyperspace continued to grow, it could grow large enough to engulf the entire planet." They decided to send us back to the ship so we could smash the equipment. They said that they had complete control over space and time at Montauk and that they could send us anywhere and to any time. It was a time tunnel, actually more than a time machine. We got axes and started smashing the tubes, tube banks and smaller equipment. Eventually the generator wound down. Before the ship re-emerged in the harbor, however, we saw sailors buried in the steel deck and bulkhead. One of them was our younger brother. Because of the process of rematerializing out of hyperspace into our reality. As the fields collapsed, the molecular structure of the sailors' bodies was also shifting. If they were moving around, and a lot of them were, they would be in fluid state until they rematerialized. If they were floating around and hit a wall when it rematerialized, they would be stuck in it. Our little brother Jim died that way, stuck in steel. Duncan jumped overboard again. He disappeared back into the future. I stayed there on board and eventually the fields rematerialized.
So both Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron time traveled through a time tunnel. How could this possibly happen? Let's go back to 1972 Camp Hero with its mind control experimentation. Over the years, the Montauk research on their mind control techniques eventually got to the point where a psychic's thoughts could be manifested both subjectively and objectively. And they discovered that the matter that a psychic manifested could appear at different times, depending on what the psychic was thinking. Thus, what would happen if a psychic thought of a car but thought of it appearing last week? It was this line of thinking and experimentation that led to the idea that one could bend time itself. After years of research, time portals were opened. The Montauk project eventually came to a bizarre climax with a time vortex being opened back to 1943 and the original Philadelphia experiment. And Duncan Cameron was considered a primary psychic. According to Duncan, August 12, 1983, a full-blown time portal was fully functioning at Montauk, but things were out of control. And Duncan called together a group of psychics and decided to crash the project. While sitting in the Montauk chair, Duncan unleashed a giant beast, a Bigfoot-like giant beast, from his subconscious, which wrecked the base and literally destroyed the project. After the destruction of the facility was closed for good, all the staff were brainwashed, shot, or sworn to absolute secrecy, and all records destroyed. The show picks up in November 6, 1983. August 12 of that same year was when Duncan Cameron brought a monster into form to bring the Montauk program to an abrupt halt. And it was sealed in cement along with the massive time vortex that led to hyperspace. Thus Duncan's monster is in hyperspace or the Upside Down, and that monster is the one that 11 made a contact with during season 1. In order to have this contact happen, the show had to start sometime after August 12, 1983. This also explains why there's only one monster in the Upside Down so far. But sooner or later, we'll get to see more monsters from the Upside Down and it will all go super crazy. But will the show ever stay in 80s? I think the show will end somewhere around in year 2003 with a massive power outage across the country. 4 kids all grown up, but the portal to the Upside Down is not completely sealed. 11 needs extra help. The boys come in, together with Elle, they defeat the monster. Why year 2003? Let's go back to Al Bielek's interview. During the interview, the interviewer asked him why the government did not want to interfere with him. Why?
The government does not dare touch us until 2003. It is 20 years after the 1983 incident. Time equations show that, because of the Earth's biorhythms, it takes 20 years for the whole thing to stabilize down to the way it was before any of this happened. If this time hole is not dampened by something in 2003, it could flare up again and get worse.
In other words, Al and Duncan are the dampening factors. And what happens if Al dies before 2003?
Depending on how close it is to 2003, the effect could be a very unstabilizing and unsettling event for Earth. If both still alive on August 12, 2003, the whole thing becomes stable and probably shuts down, unless someone builds hardware to extend it.
Could this be the real cause of Northeast blackout of 2003? You know what that is? It was a widespread power outage that occurred throughout parts of the northeastern and midwestern United States and the Canadian province of Ontario on Thursday, August 14, 2003. Very close to August 12. Authorities were initially unable to determine the cause of the massive outage. But later, an investigation by a joint U.S.-Canada task force traced the problem back to an Ohio company, First Energy Corporation. They found out when the company's East Lake plant shut down unexpectedly after overgrown trees came into contact with a power line. And it triggered a series of problems that led to a chain reaction of outages. Is that why we saw the gate opened in the base of a tree in the woods and the show started with massive power outage after Will disappeared?
Reports of surges and power outages all across the county. Last night, hundreds of homes in East Hawkins were affected, leaving many residents in the dark.
Maybe this is the reason why the showrunners decided to have the show take place in Indiana, another Midwestern state close to Ohio instead of New York? Another interesting thing to notice is that instead of using the Montauk chair, which was probably destroyed on August 12, 1983, the showrunners have decided to use sensory deprivation tank or isolation tank. Sensory deprivation tank is a lightless, soundproof tank filled with salt water at skin temperature, in which individuals float. Sensory deprivation tank was developed in 1954 by John C. Lilly. During his training in psychoanalysis at the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health, Lilly experimented with sensory deprivation. After 10 years of experimentation without taking any psychoactive substances, he tried floating in combination with a psychedelic agent, mostly LSD, which at that time was legal in the US. There is a film/novel based on this called Altered States, and as you can see, there's some similarity between Eddie's sensory deprivation tank and Eleven's. And spoiler. Later Eddie transformed into a monster. Maybe Eleven too? I'm a monster. I really hope not, and we'll talk more about 11 in my next video. Whether it's true or just another far-fetched story made up by unemployed conspiracy theorists, all I can say is, it's pretty interesting. All in all, Stranger Things is an awesome show and probably will only get better with time. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and we'll be back for more. Thanks for watching.